to Affinity Talks Gospel Podcast. We are talking to various of our partners in the Affinity family, some about the gospel work they're doing, and some about the history of the church in various locations. And I'm delighted today to be welcoming Raymond Blair and Jamie Bambrick to talk about the history of the church in Ireland. So welcome, Raymond. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, I'm a native of County Donegal, which is in the very far north of Ireland, though it's in the Republic of Ireland. To have a great Irish irony there. And I studied history at Trinity College Dublin. I then was called to be a minister of the Reformed Church of Ireland. I served as church planter for over 20 years in Galway, in the west of Ireland. I then ministered in the Mavati, County Derry, for about 12 years. And over this last year, I've been ministering in a place called Dervock, near Ballymoney, North Antrim. I'm interested in history and all its facets. In fact, last year I was the president of the County Donegal Historical Society. And I teach church history at the Reformed Theological College in Belfast.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And Jamie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I suddenly feel very out of my depth saying that I basically am a YouTuber, but there you go. I'm slightly more than that. I am an associate pastor in a Church of Ireland church in Craigavon, which is sort of just south of Lough Neagh in the middle of Northern Ireland. And from Belfast originally, I've done a number of different church pastoral roles in various contexts, mostly in Belfast, but then also over in Cambridge. And have been on staff where I am for about 18 months. And then just over a year ago, started a YouTube channel. And I've also written a little bit of a sort of a book on the history and potentially the future of the church here in Northern Ireland. So it's a little bit of a hobby of mine that I enjoy delving into and enjoy sort of gleaning from the history of the place where I'm from, and always happy to share it as well.
Brilliant. Well, you're both experts compared to me, so that's the only kind of definition of an expert: someone who knows slightly more than the person they're talking to. So you'll do fine, both of you. Just a question of principle. We've done a few of these. We've done one on the history of church in England and Wales and Scotland, and I always ask at the beginning, what's the point? What's the point of thinking about the history of the church anywhere? But in particular, what's the point of looking at the history of the church in Ireland as a whole, and in Northern Ireland in particular? Raymond, maybe you could kick off answering that question. Why study church history?
Yes, why study church history? I suppose the classic quotation to do this is, history is God's story. And we can take the working and the hand of God in history and in the life of the church over the generations and over the centuries. And particularly looking at the history of the church in Ireland, I suppose the most encouraging thing is, despite all the upheavals, all the tragedies, all the controversies, all the troubles, God has preserved his church from the time when it was first established right up until the present time. And he's still preserving the church despite the advance of secularism in both north and south.
That's a good answer. Jamie, what do you think? Why did you get interested in it?
Yeah, I suppose a couple of reasons for me. One is most people will probably be somewhat aware of this. C.S. Lewis has a great introduction to a work by Athanasius on the Incarnation. He talks about the reading of old books. And he says, essentially his premise is that when you read something that's old, it points out your own blind spots. Obviously, every generation has its blind spots. But that you recognize theirs, but they also point out yours. And so there's something helpful in doing so. I also do think that particularly the church history of Ireland is quite relevant at this moment, because the history of the church in Ireland began as the Roman Empire, the Western Empire, was in a stage of collapse. And suddenly God did something in this part of the world where Christianity was spread once again to Western Europe. And I do think that we're seeing something that might be a little bit like that. I think you can overstate that case, but nonetheless, we're very much seeing that the Western world is going in a poor direction. And it's inspiring to see what God can do. It's not saying that he'll do the same thing exactly again. I don't think he repeats himself, but I think sometimes what God does rhymes throughout history. And therefore, it's good to see, oh, this has been done before, and what if God did it again in our day?
Yeah. Well, let's start at the beginning. The gospel coming to Ireland. Probably most people, even if they're not the experts that you two are, would think about Patrick. But is that the right place to start? Maybe Raymond, you could kick us off.
Well, of course, we're going back a long way to the 5th century or so AD, and the records are very sparse. So we have to be very careful, I think, about saying too much about the arrival of Christianity in Ireland. I think it's fair to say, however, that Patrick certainly didn't do it single-handedly. He didn't bring the gospel to Ireland single-handedly. More than likely, he wasn't the first. Evidence would suggest that Christianity was probably brought to Ireland by Christian traders who were trading back and forward from Britain and elsewhere, and they're unnamed and unknown. And probably the gospel came to Ireland in that kind of way. Patrick certainly played a key role, though he's been misrepresented in many ways over the centuries. So 5th century or so, and it flourished for a number of centuries. But then again, of course, there are so many ups and downs, and the church tended to veer away from the truth very quickly. There has been a tendency, I think, in historical studies to idealize what is called Celtic Christianity, that somehow Celtic Christianity was purer and more exalted and better than the other Christianity. But again, there are a lot of myths about that and misunderstandings. So a lot we don't know, but I think we can say God did use Patrick. But he also used many, many other unnamed servants to bring the gospel to Ireland and then send people out from Ireland onto the continent with the good news of the gospel.
Yeah. What was Ireland like, Jamie? If you looked into that at all, what was Ireland like at that time when Patrick and others came across? What was going on? What was tribally, organizationally happening?
Yeah, so Ireland was functionally a tribal society and had sat largely on the outskirts of the Roman Empire. It obviously had some interaction, but was not somewhere that was successfully invaded or even really attempted by the Romans, as far as I'm aware, or part of the Roman civilization. So what we had was Druid paganism was kind of the religion of the society at that point, which was a very dark religion. So human sacrifice would have been, part of that. Not the only part, but also a lot of sexual debauchery and so on, being key parts of those rituals, as was often the case in these pagan societies throughout the world. You had a few sort of key gods that had their various ways of preferring sacrifice, you could say. So there was Tyrannus. Julius Caesar talks about people being burned in wicker cages. You may have heard of that. That was largely to the god Tyrannus, who would have been in the Celtic pantheon. You had Essos, who liked people as hanged and garroted or impaled, and then you had Totates, who liked to have them drowned. So it was not an easy place. I think there is some sign, as Raymond said there, about people coming earlier. And so it wasn't that there had been no light of the gospel, but it was certainly still at that point prior to Patrick, a pretty dark and fairly dangerous place, and not a natural environment for the gospel to flourish, because a lot of the things that permitted it to flourish in Roman society, such as the Pax Romana, such as road systems, these various practical things that God in his providence obviously was aware would happen and would lead to the flourishing of the gospel, didn't exist here. So it would have been probably perceived as quite a tough place to bring the gospel, and not somewhere that would have had a natural openness or a lot of the framework of Christian thinking that perhaps we see in say Greek philosophy and so on, which comes into the Christian world to some extent as well, and helps us categorize some of these things. So it was very different to a lot of the rest of the Roman Empire.
Why did Patrick and others? Yeah, why did Patrick and others want to take the gospel to? Was it that as we should be motivated by the Great Commission? Was that the reason they were going, or were they fleeing persecution?
No.
Or did God use some other means? Maybe Raymond, go first on that one.
Well, the wonderful thing about Patrick was that he first came to Ireland as a slave. His own confession or confessio gives the details of how, as a young boy of about 16, He was taken by Irish slave traders from somewhere, probably in mainland Britain, and brought across to Ireland. And he worked as a slave. The actual locality in Ireland is disputed. Some say County Antrim, where I am, Slemish. Others would say County Mayo in the west of Ireland. Wherever he was, he spent quite a while as a slave. But while in Ireland, he experienced, although he had some Christian background, but while in Ireland, he experienced a religious conversion. He describes it in terms of Psalm 40, that he was like a stone lying in deep mud. But then he who is mighty at his God raised him up and placed him on top of a wall. So he experienced a religious conversion. And then he escaped in due course from slavery. But while back with his folk in England, probably in England, he received a vision calling him back to Ireland. And he believed that God was calling him back to make the good news of the gospel known to the pagans, the people who did not know God in Ireland. And he was, I think, motivated all the more so to do that because he had the conviction that he was at the very ends of the earth. The way the gospel presents us with the truth that when the gospel reaches the ends of the earth, then the Lord will return. So there's a very strong eschatological element in Patrick's mission, that it's so urgent. It's so urgent that the gospel be brought to Ireland because the end is near. Now, Patrick was mistaken by the fact that he was at the ends of the earth, but his urgency is nevertheless very commendable.
Yeah, and it's really encouraging. You've got a completely dark pagan society, as Jamie was describing, and the gospel can and did break in, and there was probably less sociological reasons why it would get there and would have some impact. But the power of the gospel, so that's encouraging in itself when we think about our own dark society at the moment. Would it have been, Jamie, a gospel we recognise? I think when we were prepping for this in the conversation, I asked you this question. I asked this of to tell you why, because people from particularly people from England from a distance just think of Patrick as being related to the Catholic Church, really. Probably not a few miracle myths about snakes and stuff, and we're not really thinking he's preaching the gospel. We're just thinking he's some kind of mythical figure, probably. So would he have preached the gospel in a way that we recognise, do you reckon?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, these people are quite distinct to us. It's a long time ago, and they probably have some emphases that we perhaps didn't have. But obviously, one of the things that Patrick is most known for here in Ireland, and again, there may be some mythology behind this. Although I kind of like to believe that but people throughout church history were trying to at least tell the truth, that they weren't making up stories out of whole cloth, that they had some reason for writing these down. So one of the things most known for is his explanation of the Trinity, using the clover. Now, again, you can get into the exact, is that perfect theology? But he was very clearly trying to give the picture of the one true God in three persons to this polytheistic society. He did so there's a lot of baptism stories, a lot of various images we have of those as well, obviously done later, but so he was encouraging proper conversion away from a polytheistic religion to the Trinitarian God of the Bible. I probably don't know enough about his specific preaching. Maybe Raymond could speak more to that if there's sermon examples. I know the stuff that he writes does seem to be theologically rich. He has a lot of reference to the Psalms and so on. So he very much was from what I can see, a good Christian. And there was also, when we think about the relationship with Catholicism, obviously the Catholic Church has developed very significantly from that period through to what we would see the Catholic Church as being today. And there was a little bit, and Raymond, you alluded to it earlier, where there was a little bit of a sort of distinction between, say, Celtic Christianity and Latin Christianity. And the Celtic Christianity would have had, operated slightly more outside of the typical bounds of the Catholic Church. So I think it was broadly a good, solid gospel that he would have preached, with perhaps some slightly different emphases than we would, but that emphasis on the Trinity and getting people to recognize the one God of Scripture and then convert was core to his message, as far as I can tell.
I would agree. I think there were the two areas that are evident from his own writings to know about Patrick, read needed his own writings, and there are two writings that have survived. One is the Confession or the Confessio, and the other is the letter to the soldiers of Croaticus. There are two things in those letters that perhaps we as modern evangelicals wouldn't feel too comfortable with. One is an emphasis on celibacy and the monastic life, and the second one is, and this is not really Patrick's fault, but he does quote or refer to, allude to the apocryphal and the apocryphal writings, which therefore may have shaped his theology in certain ways. But other than that, I agree. The Trinitarian emphasis is extremely strong in Patrick's confession, and the gospel of grace. He speaks of the grace of God over and over again. Patrick's most famous words are, "I, Patrick, a sinner." He appreciates it's by the grace of God that he is what he is.
Yeah. This is going to be really hard now for both of you, but I'm going to ask you to try and pick a few key milestones now to to take us in 10 minutes or so all the way up through to the present day. So maybe a key milestone or a key understanding for me would be, when did we get from Patrick preaching the gospel to a few people and other people as well, other monks or traveling preachers, to a church that we could recognize as a set of churches that were kind of affiliated together in some way? How do we get to that?
So Patrick's strategy seemed to be very much to try and reach the Druid lords, and in a tribal society that makes a lot of sense, where there was this sort of collective conversion thing that went on. And of course, you can get into, right, well, how true and how perfect were all of those individual conversions, but that did lead to a significant societal shift really during his lifetime. There was a big, it wasn't just a minor thing. You say preaching the gospel to a few people. I mean, Patrick's probably most famous moment of his ministry was there was a feast, an annual feast. I think it was called the Feast of Beltane. And the high priest, or the high king rather, would light his fire. No one was allowed to light a fire until he had lit his fire on top of this small hill called the Hill of Tara. And so Patrick goes to a hill down the road, basically slightly higher as well, and decides, good time to light my Paschal bonfire. And so the king, King Leary, allegedly, again, some of this, again, I like to sort of go, okay, I think there's a degree of truth in this, said, if we do not extinguish this flame, it will spread all over Ireland. And he sent over his troops. Apparently, Patrick quoted one of the Psalms, said, "May God arise and his enemies be scattered." And every time they came to arrest him, these people fell on their face. Just the power of God seemed to be on his side. And again, you can try and go, well, how much of that do we have, concrete evidence for? But nonetheless, that seemed to be his style. It seemed to be very in keeping with what he did, and the kind of evangelism he engaged in, which was, we're going to take on these pagan gods in public. And that led to, I think, a very quick transformation of Ireland in a number of ways. So again, estimates vary, but I've heard as high as 100,000 people come into faith throughout his sort of ministry lifetime, and various other things. The Irish slave trade. Again, he came to Ireland as a slave. That was, I don't know if it was entirely wiped out, but it was certainly put very much on the back foot, and he was a real advocate against slavery. So there was a very quick shift with Patrick, and then obviously the people that he worked with, and I think his ministry methods were effective in reaching that society.
And is there then, Raymond, a church that's kind of affiliated to the international church, which in effect was the Roman Catholic Church at that time? Does that happen?
Well, there are tensions. There are various synods because there are differences some differences, right? Divergences between the church in Ireland, or the Celtic Church, as it's called. That's a rather vague and I think inadequate term, but there are differences. And it's only gradually that Rome was able to assert its ecclesiastical authority over the church in Ireland. So there was a degree of, if you like, independence or freedom to maneuver. But eventually, by the Middle Ages, certainly Ireland is drawn in line with Rome.
Right. And Patrick himself, just before that, he was known in the church sort of across Europe, wasn't he? I think.
Well, in his own lifetime, I don't know about that.
Right.
I mean, his reputation would have spread over the centuries. Yes, gradually. But I suppose what's called the cult of St. Patrick grew up, but it was also mixed up then with lots of strange ideas, semi-pagan ideas too. So quite a complicated picture.
Right,
Yeah.
and
He was just apologies. Sorry. He was commissioned. He did have people sitting over him. That's part of his writings, is that they weren't altogether happy with some of what he was doing, and some of his history. There appears to have been some major sin that he may have committed at some point, and people speculate as to what that is. But he refers to that in his writings. Without saying specifically what it was, but it was held against him by some of his overseers. So he wasn't sort of operating as a total maverick outside of the bounds of any commissioning. You know, when he felt called to come to Ireland, he went and he trained and was then sent. So there was some funding and stuff involved, but obviously with distances being so great and so on, that there was much more of a it was much harder to maintain that sort of centralized control. But he wasn't operating outside of the ecclesiastical system entirely either.
Yeah, and both Celtic Christianity, I understand it's an inadequate term, and Roman Catholic Christianity in Ireland were both in a sense from the same source, in that they were from people coming in from outside, preaching the gospel, presumably.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the people who came in were from different sources. I mean, maybe people from Wales, which had. And again, when we were talking about Wales, there was the same comment actually made that there's not much clarity about what we actually meant by Celtic Christianity, and so on. So it's the same comment about that, but maybe some people who are more of that tradition came across to Ireland as well, perhaps from Wales.
Or Scotland, yes.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
You want to talk, Jamie?
I was just going to say, I mean, there seems to be some, and Crawford Gribben's written a little bit about this. I'm pulling it out of the back of my head here, but there seem to be some slight variations between perhaps the way the Irish Church functioned in terms of bishops being more accountable to their local congregations versus the central, synods. That actually it was slightly more congregationally minded, perhaps, and that may just have been a feature of geography, that may, and of just the time in history that it was. That's my understanding of. There were some differences there that may not have been even intentional differences. They may just have been the way things worked out being.
It was also very intensely monastic. Now, of course, monasticism was on the continent as well, but Irish Christianity became very intensely monastic, and a lot of the people who went out to Europe with the gospel from Ireland were from that kind of background.
Yeah.
Right. So, thinking about sort of milestones working through, presumably there's no Baptists in Credo Baptists, sorry, in Ireland, because we came along later. So there's one church, which is the Roman Catholic Church, but as it was then, not as we would think about it now. Presumably it kind of adopted as the Roman Catholic Church diverged more and more from the gospel. Presumably the church in Ireland had some similar trajectory, did it?
Yeah,
Raymond?
I think so. I think one of the saddest aspects, actually Rome tried to curb this to some extent, was the tendency of Irish Christianity to merge with kind of pagan traditions and pagan viewpoints. The Holy Wells, for example, of Ireland are well known, and in various other ways as well. There was a kind of merging with some of the pagan ideas in Ireland. So Rome actually in the late Middle Ages tried to, and then later on as well, tried to curb that a bit, some degree anyway.
But we're going to go right up to the Reformation. So if you want to tell me anything I need to know between 500 and the Reformation.
Yeah. So the monastic movement is very interesting in Ireland. So there was these 12 figures, and again, how they sorted out exactly who these were, but there's these 12 figures known as the 12 Apostles of Ireland, that came out of one monastery in Clonard, and a guy called Finian of Clonard, who basically trained all of them, and they were responsible for a number of things. So one of them would have been really establishing the faith in Ireland, and then also the beginning of the sort of Irish monastic missionary movement. So you have some very exciting figures. You have Kieran of Clonmacnoise. So he was allegedly in class one day with his as part of Finian's monastery, and he got made fun of because he had only memorized half of the Gospel of Matthew, which I think is rather weak, to be honest. If you've not memorized all of it, what are you even doing? And so they called him Kieran half Matthew. And Finian said, no, call him Kieran half Ireland, because he will win half the island and the rest will be left to us. But the way those monasteries worked was they were monasteries, but they were also quite missionally minded. That they viewed themselves as being part of the community and part of the clan structure, and basically weren't just places of private devotion. There were some that were more like that, but there were also others that were very much like a university, media center, really, business center, all of that going on. So, and Finian would send these guys out once they were trained. So Kieran went out to a place called Clonmacnoise, which sits basically at a key intersection between an esker, which is a sort of raised ridge through the boglands of Ireland that ran north to south, or that ran east to west, and then a river system that ran north to south, I believe. And he starts his monastery there, like right in the middle of Ireland, and it becomes this key training place for people across the island. If anyone's heard of Alcuin, who was a monk that Charlemagne actually brought in to sort of lead the education movement that he was leading at that point, trying to educate the masses. Alcuin was trained at Clonmacnoise, so this was like a key. It was like the Cambridge University of its day, really, really elite sort of thinking coming out from there, and good scholarship. You have others. I mean, I don't want to take all the time, but so maybe if you want to get into more of the details, Raymond can look at some of them. But you have guys like Colmkill, you have Columbanus, these guys who then went out from Ireland to various other places to spread the gospel.
Yes, Columkill is one of particular interest to me because he was born repeatedly, probably actually born in County Donegal, my home county, and eventually went to bring the gospel to the pagan Picts of Scotland, and was greatly used there.
Right.
And so that would have been like the origins of, say, Lindisfarne, for instance, would have come out from that movement then of Colmkill. So people have heard of Lindisfarne. It traces back to Colmkill.
Right. So the cultural connections between Ireland and Scotland, and the language connections, is that more gospel related, or more trading related, or more kind of Norse traders or something related, or is it a bit of everything?
I think a bit of everything. It's multifaceted. It's because of the geographical proximity. I mean, it's amazing. If I go up to the north coast, up to a place called Ballycastle, on a clear day, I can see Scotland. So there's so many interactions going on. Not surprising, therefore, that Christianity should spread back and forth between Ireland and Scotland.
Right. It's very crass of me, but I'm going to jump to the Reformation and just say, how did the Reformation interact with this Irish church that was happening? Give us a kick off with that, Raymond.
Well, I suppose part of the tragedy of Christianity in Ireland is the intersection between the if you like, the Reformation and the whole political issues, the colonial expansion of Britain into Ireland. There's a close association between the two, and that certainly complicated the whole thing. So that, for example, here in Northern Ireland especially, the idea of Protestant is often linked with the idea of planter, or people who took the land. So it creates there's still a barrier there that has to be overcome, and people need to see beyond that. But there is that major complication because of the close association between, if you like, political expansion and conquest and the establishment of Reformation churches.
Right. So did the Reformation come in the sense of theological writings and stuff, or was it because of William of Orange or something like that? Is that how the Reformation came to your shores?
Well, there were and there are great theological writings. I mean, Bishop Usher, for example, of the Church of Ireland, or established church, wonderful theological Calvinist Reformed writer. Bishop Bedell, who the Cavan area, Kilmore, who sought to promote the gospel through an Irish New Testament or Bible, but that there wasn't enough of that. There needed to be more of that. There needed to be more sensitivity, I think, to the native culture and not the imposition of, British cultural values too closely linked with the gospel. That's created a major problem.
Right. But what ended up, so there was a political invasion as well.
Yes.
And did that didn't bring Presbyterianism at that time, did it? That would have brought the Church of England. I'm reaching it a bit because I don't know what I'm talking about. Help me out, Jamie, a little bit.
So I think it's the English relationship with Ireland is quite important to this, and then the relationship between England and Rome also ties in pretty importantly. So originally, the Pope, which is Hadrian IV, told King Henry II to invade Ireland in, I think it was 1155, because they weren't really Catholic enough, which is quite funny. That was the reason. So that really brought Ireland under English rule. And then obviously when England experienced the Reformation, and in a you can say there was plenty of flaws there. That wasn't just a purely theological thing either. That then got brought over to Ireland in a number of ways. So Cromwell and his history in Ireland is probably quite rightly negatively received. And I think people possibly blow that up to an extent that it wasn't maybe quite as bad as all of that. But there was a significant diminishment of, say, Catholic land holdings in Ireland during that period, where people were basically planted into various parts of Ireland, a lot of them in the north, where with a view to Protestantizing the country politically. The Presbyterians came over from Scotland in part. Again, it's a bit mixed, but part of the reason is that they were experiencing persecution in Scotland and then came over to Northern Ireland as part of that. But that also led to tensions and various factions of, right, you have this other group coming in here at this point in time and taking land, or so it's quite a complex and very drawn out and quite messy history, with a degree of real faith and then a degree of some political opportunism and perhaps abuse, in that way, where the Big Brother sort of mistreated the people here to some extent.
Also, the attempt to establish Protestantism by the passing of the notorious, what are called the penal laws, whereby there were, for example, Catholics weren't allowed to enter Parliament or be members of Parliament right up until the time of Catholic emancipation in the 19th century. Catholic couldn't own a horse for more than a certain value, etc. So there were penal laws established to attempt to promote Protestantism, which isn't the way to promote the gospel.
No. So when are we talking about by now? What sort of years or centuries?
The 17th century, the penal laws. Really subsequent to the final political conquest of Ireland after the flight of the Earls in the early 17th century. The penal laws are imposed from the 17th century right up until through the 18th century, though the degree to which they were enforced is a matter of debate, but nevertheless they were there.
So by the 17th century into the 18th century, politically the whole of Ireland is controlled by the United Kingdom, and religiously there's Presbyterianism, there's, I suppose, the Church of Ireland, which would be Anglican. And there's no Roman Catholic churches at all, or there's still a lot of Roman Catholic churches?
Oh, they are, but they're
loads. Yeah.
But very often they're forced to, for example, there are such things as what are called mass rocks scattered throughout Ireland, where they didn't have buildings, so they had to, carry out their religious devotions in the open air. But there were some buildings too, and eventually, by the 19th century, great buildings began to be built again.
Right, so during the 19th century,
part of Cromwell's, part of Cromwell's sort of plan. They did the same thing in Scotland, which was forbidding public mass but permitting private Catholic devotion. So he wasn't a sort of total anti-religious freedom figure. Actually, he was considered some people say that he saved the Catholic Church in Scotland, but nonetheless, there was a degree of it being suppressed societally.
Yeah. But by the 19th century, you said emancipation. So there was some law passed in the United Kingdom that allowed freedom of worship for Catholics.
Well, more than that, also access to the political institutions. Daniel O'Connell is the famous figure associated with Catholic emancipation, 1829, I think, if memory serves me right, the Catholic Emancipation Act. And thereafter, then, Catholicism grows in great influence and power until it becomes the dominant political, social, and religious force in the land.
Is that really sad for you guys reflecting on that?
It is sad. Yes, it is sad.
And then by then it gets bound up with a political kind of independence movement, does it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Generally.
Yes. Yeah.
Would that be even in the 19th century that was aligning in that way?
Good, Jamie, huh?
Yeah. I mean, so in the 1800s, you have so the Catholic Church actually does quite a good job of societal reform and re-Catholicizing the society. Whether you consider that to be positive or negative, it's neither here nor there. But they were effective and led this kind of promotion of what you might call cultural Catholicism, to the point that you had some, in the 1900s. So after a good 50 to 100 years of that program and those efforts, you would have, maybe around 90% weekly mass attendance amongst Catholics, right? So they had a lot of people showing up for church. Obviously, then you have a geographic division where you've got Ulster, or what most of Ulster anyway, where you have this history of Presbyterianism and much more of a Protestant theological perspective, and also much more of a tie to, because of those Scottish and further British, and English links, more of a tie to Great Britain than the Irish Catholics would have had. So yeah, these things sort of were lining up and shaping in that way. There are various other things. I mean, the famine probably was a relatively important thing of really stirring up a lot, and it still exists to this day amongst Irish people, of dislike for the British, because they seem to partly blame England and the political establishment there for the deaths of perhaps a few million people, or at least 1 million plus, and a few others, a number of other millions perhaps emigrating as well. So these things are splitting into a couple of different camps. Yeah, by that point.
Was it hard? Obviously, it's still hard, but was it hard just take us into the 20th century? Was it hard to separate the gospel from politics?
Yeah, very, very hard. There's a slogan here in Northern Ireland which I greatly dislike. It's called "For God and Ulster," and I believe it's idolatrous, because often what it really means is for Ulster and God. That there's like an idol, that the be all and end all of everything is British identity. That's turned into an idol now. I'm not denying the right people to feel British. I don't feel British. I was born in the Republic of Ireland, so I actually feel Irish. But I don't deny the right of people to feel, Christians to feel British and to associate and have a love for Britain. I don't deny that. But the slogan "For God and Ulster," I think, is sort of saying, Ulster is the ultimate value and loyalty. That I think is idolatrous, and it's very unhelpful to the spread of the gospel.
Mm.
Yeah, and with the partition as well, you would have had these other things going on, like the Ulster Covenant, which was a document signed by Protestants, essentially doing roughly what you've said, which is pledging allegiance to the United Kingdom, really above all else. So it was Protestants who were doing that. You have this famous phrase, which is a Protestant place for Protestant people, said of Northern Ireland, and then similarly in the south as well. You have this real, like, we are a Catholic nation, right. And Protestants down there, similar to how Catholics were treated up here, were then as the partition occurred. They were treated as second-class citizens as well. So yeah, it was.
I'm sometimes asked. As a Christian, are you in favour of the United Kingdom? Or are you in favour of United Ireland? I say there's only one kingdom I'm truly committed to, and that's the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And I think as Christians, we need to emphasise that as long as there's the freedom to worship and evangelise, the political thing is only secondary. It shouldn't be the be all and end all of our mission.
Yeah. I'm going to have to take you to the sort of present day. I'm jumping over the whole independence of the Republic of Ireland and the General Post Office and all that whole thing, as though it was nothing. But obviously, it's massive historical significance for the island of Ireland. Take you up to the present day. What's the state of the church in Northern Ireland, particularly where both you two guys are? How would you say what's the state of the church now, in terms of its health and its allegiance to the gospel, and its decoupling from politics? Raymond, you go first.
Well, there's still a strong element of coupling with politics, but there are many who are genuinely, committed to the gospel. I think secularization is advancing in Northern Ireland. The percentage of people attending the traditional evangelical churches is in decline. However, there are new churches emerging. Now, some of their theology I would have issues with, but there has been a growth in new independent churches in Northern Ireland, as indeed there has been in the Republic of Ireland. In fact, Crawford Gribben, who was mentioned earlier in his book, The Rise and Fall of Christian Ireland, he places the hope for the future upon what he calls the arrival of new Patricks, new churches been established, and there are new churches been established north and south. I'm hopeful that there'll be a renewal and revival more than the established churches as well, the denominations, and there are some elements of that, but it's not really a very encouraging picture among the long-standing denominations in general.
What do you think, Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you came to particularly Northern Ireland, we can leave the Republic out of it because we'll just end up talking about the Catholic Church and the decline there, and it's probably not an area that we're as involved in. But I think if the average English person came over to Northern Ireland, I think they would still be. I think they'd be surprised at how much Christianity is here. There was a recent study by the Evangelical Alliance, and again, right, we've got to be cautious as to what people mean by this, but 50% of the country said that they're practicing Christian, which, I don't necessarily think that they would all qualify from our end as actually being practicing Christians, but there is that religiosity imbues a lot of the province. And with that, there is, I think, more genuine Christianity than most places in Western Europe. I think you find very few places that have as much genuine Christianity. And so for me, when, I totally agree, secularization is advancing and, we're slightly behind perhaps the mainland in that regard. But nonetheless, I think there is perhaps more of a platform to push back in some areas. How that works, again, you could end up looking at, politically what happens and so on. But one of the things that does encourage me here is I think that there are quite strong pulpits comparatively. I think there's a little bit more freedom to preach with a bit of conviction on some of the challenges of the day, and congregations, in my experience, are quite hungry for that now. So I can't speak too much to elsewhere, but nonetheless, I do think that there is a reasonable degree of health among the church as it currently exists, with some serious challenges facing it. But I think if we did decide, look, we're going to take a stand and we're going to do the things that Scripture calls us to do, we're going to preach as we're called to preach, that actually I think we have a bit of critical mass there that could help, create a meaningful response that would affect the whole province.
Just to draw things to a close, and it has been a real whistle-stop tour, but in looking and surveying the whole history, you said at the beginning, both of you, about the value of looking back. when you think about now, and you think what to pray for, and you think what encourages, what have you learned from looking into history, and what does that encourage you to do or to pray for now? Start with you, Jamie.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we haven't even touched is the Ulster revival of 1859, and there was a period where God really moved, and it was largely among the sort of Presbyterian churches, but some of the other Protestant denominations as well were impacted, where seemingly 100,000 people came to faith in the space of just over a year. And for me, I do think that whilst you don't want to just become purely revivalistic and that becomes everything, I think we could really do with something like that. We could really do with God moving in power and the Spirit of God just breathing on the church in a fresh way. And because there's history of that, it can happen. And so for me, that's the kind of thing where, if we're praying for the church here, yeah, we want to pray that there would be some dramatic, spirit-filled, move of God in the province that reaches people, because that is ultimately where the hope is. We can look at the politics, we can look at all of that stuff, and I think there needs to be answers there too, but I think it starts with God working among his people.
What do you think, Raymond?
To move southward, perhaps, because I do have a great burden for the South, given that I was born there and ministered there for over 20 years. I think there's a cause for thanksgiving that while there are some theological concerns in regard to some of the churches, there has been a whole new growth of relatively small evangelical churches, even in, not just in the cities, but in some of the larger towns in the Republic of Ireland. And that's a source of joy. And I pray that will only increase and be enhanced. And even the fact that in the Republic of Ireland at the moment, there's a lot of people coming in, and some of them are bringing the gospel in as well. I think that will help and bring blessing. It's helped to bring, I think, renewal and refreshment to some of the older, long-established congregations of our particular denomination. I think in the Church of Ireland as well, and Presbyterian Church, the influx of people who come with faith will help to bring some renewal and blessing as well.
Well, that's really helpful. Just as a little postscript, anything you'd recommend for people who are listening or watching to read or to look at for kind of if they want to know more?
Yes, there is one book. For a long time, there was no book. There were only little bits and pieces here, but there's one, I believe, masterly overview of the history of Christianity in Ireland, written by Dr. Crawford Gribben of Queen's University, Belfast, called The Rise and Fall of Christian Ireland. So taking it from the time of the very beginning, before Patrick, right up until the present day. So Crawford Gribben, The Rise and Fall of Christian Ireland, I would thoroughly recommend it.
It's brilliant. And you would recommend that, I'm sure, Jamie. And you wrote something yourself as well?
Yeah, I wrote the Coming Ulster Revival. So I was looking at kind of a little bit of the history of the church, specifically in the north. And it is not just about the history of Ireland, but it includes some of what God has done here, where I see things being presently. And it's largely in my church circles that I'm referring to. But then also where it could go, and perhaps what I would suggest.
Tell me the title of the book.
The Coming Ulster Revival, just something nice and then the sub heading is Saving Northern Ireland and the West for the Glory of God and for the crack. Because I think that's important.
Where would one get that book, Jamie? I haven't seen that book. Where would one get it?
Amazon.
It's an Amazon
thing.
So thank you.
It's a bit of fun. A bit of tongue in cheek. It's quick. It's not a scholarly, history of Ireland, but here's some of the cool stories, and here's where we might be at.
Why do you call it?
Where I'd like to see us go.
Why do you call it the Coming Ulster Revival? Because you're expecting another revival.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And do you use Ulster as a collective name for Northern Ireland?
Yeah, ish. So Ireland's divided into 4 provinces, and Donegal is in Ulster, but not in Northern Ireland, for instance. so there's 9 counties in Ulster, 6 of which are in Northern Ireland, but it's become a sort of colloquial, synonym.
Okay, really good. Well, get both of those books, and I must say thank you very much to both of you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
thank you so much for listening to Affinity Talks Gospel Podcast. Affinity is a network of evangelical churches and Christian organizations working together, sharing stories in order to encourage and equip God's people to preach and live the gospel in this generation. If you're interested in supporting this ministry, we'd love you to join us. Just head over to affinity.org.uk/join to find out more. And we look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of Affinity Talks Gospel